Associate Professor of Central Asian History and Director of the Oral History Program at the California State University, Long Beach. His book, Speaking Soviet with an Accent, Culture and Power in Kyrgyzstan, has been published by the Central Asia Content Series of the University of Pittsburgh Press in July 2012, and was a finalist for the Best Book Award of the Central Eurasian Studies Society. I won't go any farther than that. They have my phone going off. Welcome. Here, I also looked him up on, because I was looking and so great, my professor came up. He gets fabulous reviews. So welcome to Ali.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I don't look at those. Thank you.
You should. It gives you a good day.
Yeah, it worries you because they say whoever rates you on rate my professor, they either love you or hate you. There's in between. There's no in between. Thank you for inviting me. Like Susan said, I just gave a talk. I'll pass this around, not just because of me, but all the previous speakers are listed here. That Ben Loring, Dr. Loring, and his group, his center, invited all these years. So if you are looking for specialists on Central Asia, this is the almost a complete list. So I'll pass this around, and you can actually write those names down. And also, Susan, I will return these to you. Several of you asked about novels and memoirs. So I wrote down, this is sort of low-tech here, but instead of passing this around, Susan said she'd type them up. There are several novels and memoirs in the last 3-4 years. We started, in the US in English. There are some publications like The Railway by Hamid Ismailov. He's a Kyrgyz who lived in Uzbekistan. And there's a great memoir called The Silent Steppe, the memoir of a Kazakh nomad under Stalin, and several other things. And I also put down, because you are interested in comparative empires, there's a book I'm just teaching a grad class on empires, Empires in World History by Jane Burbank and Frederick Cooper. It's a huge volume, but you can actually look at it for your own teaching, and great comparative study there. So if I can give it to you. So what I'd like to do is, it's hard to follow these wonderful speakers, but what I want to do today is maybe give you rather a micro history of what we talked about. Dr. Loring showed several maps, so they're probably similar maps, so I'm going to go through the maps quickly. This is the old former Soviet Union. It shows you the area we are talking about is significantly large, but yet still, not the major part of the Soviet Union. And on the other side of the Caspian Sea, of course, you see the three republics of Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. We don't usually, even though Azerbaijan is also a Turkic-speaking Muslim country, we don't really talk about Azerbaijan in the same breadth and context of Central Asia. And of course, Armenia and Georgia, especially Armenia, the oldest Christian society and nation, is on the other side. So you are familiar with this map, so I'm going to skip. But I am going to talk about Kyrgyzstan today specifically, which used to be called Kyrgyzia. The Kyrgyz, as we pointed out, speak a Turkic language, and in their language, Kyrgyz is the way you pronounce it. Nobody else can say that. So Russians called it Kyrgyz and Kyrgyzia. So it puts it in context here. This is a nice map, but puts you in a larger context here and in a world map. This is a map of the Republic. My first experience in Kyrgyzstan was as a grad student in the University of Washington, where I lived in Osh. It's the second largest city in Kyrgyzstan, and Bishkek is the capital, which used to be called Frunze after a Moldovan general representing the Russian, imperial powers who basically conquered the land, and believe it or not, the capital's name was his name. And so as you see, it is an area where, this is an important point here, there are several enclaves, the ethnographers decided that would stay within Kyrgyzstan. These are Uzbek and Tajik enclaves. They are kind of stuck in Kyrgyzstan, and you see the same thing in Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. There are sort of, Kyrgyz enclaves that are left in these official republics. So, just to familiarize you with what it looks like, it's a beautifully, most of the country is about 5,000 feet. So, it's not an arable, it is not suitable for agriculture, only the Fergana Valley area and, the Chuy Valley up north. But this is the reason why we're going to talk about nomads. Kyrgyz people could not be agriculturalists for many reasons, environmental and other reasons, because, of course, they are mountain folks. You see some villages here, and my first book is about clubs. If you can't read Russian, it says klub on it, and these are houses of culture where the Soviets introduced all over the Soviet Union the idea that people, including the Russians, had to be educated to be able to, of course, understand Marxist-Leninist ideology, but at the same time, they needed to learn about, Western culture, Western theater, sports, and they would actually, in these clubs, learn Russian because they were, becoming part of the Soviet Union. And even though the Soviets often warned against what they called Russian chauvinism, they would want people to actually learn Russian because Russian was going to be the lingua franca where all the Soviet people were going to be able to relate to each other. As Dr. Loring pointed out, that if you go to Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan, in the main cities, most of the elite and college students and teachers speak Russian first, and they may not even be able to speak their own language other than just sort of what you might call kitchen Kyrgyz or kitchen Kazakh. So clubs are this is the sort of one-room version of larger clubs, and when I went to it in 2005, these Soviet clubs are no more functioning as clubs, but maybe kids to play soccer or football in the garden. But this is a larger version of the club. Here it's in Kyrgyz it says Medeniyet Uyu. Medeniyet means civilization, Uyu means house. So throughout the Soviet period, starting from the 30s on, the Soviets started establishing these clubs, and often, because Kyrgyzstan is, again, historically nomadic, and until the Russian, encroachment into area in the second half of the 1800s, you don't have major buildings, you don't have sedentary lifestyle. So wherever you go in Kyrgyzstan, whichever city you are in, the biggest building is usually the House of Culture. And that's how actually I became interested as a grad student, traveling around Kyrgyzstan, seeing these buildings, trying to make sense why these sort of the most Russian-looking, most Western-looking building would stand in the most prominent spot in a small village where everything else was smaller and lower. As you see, throughout the decades, they become bigger and more prominent here, and you get to a point where they're almost, palaces. And in this case, it says Dom Kulturi, meaning in Russian, again, House of Culture. But in the post-Soviet period, of course, they had very little money to run these clubs. So what happened is people like these people, these ladies, who took charge of these clubs. And they, because, I'm going to get to this a little bit later, because they see themselves educated under the Soviet system, and most often they're proud of that past, despite the economic difficulties, they continue the tradition. So this is a Kyrgyz town where the head of the House of Culture is an Uzbek woman, who's an ethnic Uzbek who lives in Kyrgyzstan, and Kyrgyz assistant, and 2 Ukrainian assistants. So that sort of tells you the ethnic diversity, and often, of course, the Soviet, this is a great propaganda slogan, and they would always say Kyrgyzstan is republic of 100 nationalities. Wherever you go to Armenia, they'll say the same thing. You go to Georgia, they'll say the same thing. So one of the most important moments in Soviet history is that we don't treat the Russians better than anybody else, and as a result, everybody in the language of the Soviets brought up, they would use the term, to the level of civilized populations. So you will even see from the 70s, sort of retro and whatever this architecture is called. So the activities in these houses of culture continued from the Soviet period. This is where I want to sort of interject what I mean by all that. So when Kyrgyzstan finally falls to the Russians, just before the Soviet Union is established, several decades before, the official historians in Kyrgyzstan will say, well, the Kyrgyz invited the Russians to rescue them from other populations in Central Asia who were dominating them. I'm not going to go into all these tribal names because you're not going to retain them. So, this is sort of the official history. The Kyrgyz invited the Russians to help them, to sort of rescue them. Yet, of course, once, as Ben explained, once the Bolsheviks start coming in, they are actually gathering allies from indigenous Kyrgyz intellectuals. There are many Kyrgyz intellectuals who believe that Bolsheviks are going to offer something to them that will bring them up into the modern world. They genuinely believe. They read Marx, they read Lenin, they read other scholars, and they, often prefer a change. So the two individuals you brought up, Sadikov and Abdurrahmanov, are two of those Kyrgyz leaders. But if you notice the date of their deaths, 1938, is when things change drastically, right? This is under Stalin's purges. Most of these original Bolsheviks, indigenous or Russian, they were purged. And what does it mean, purged? They were actually rounded up and shot. So Kyrgyzstan discovered in 1980s that there was a mine where 183 or more intellectuals of all ethnicities who were original Bolsheviks were shot in one evening, rounded up and shot. So they found them in this, basically, mine. So now it's an area called Chontash, where there's a memorial to their name. So that is a small number in comparison to how many Russians died or others died. Yet it's part of that culture. So within that culture, Soviet Union tried to introduce this idea that we are going to, once they establish these republics, Kyrgyzstan is one of the sort of later republics. Because when the Russians came in, they were confused about who was Kazakh, who was Kyrgyz. to them they all look the same. You know, these ethnographers who are a little more, educated, they try to sort of figure out through traditions and other things to sort of figure out who these ethnicities were. But they're dealing with, not ethnic groups, they're dealing with tribal, there are clans, there are tribes who are extremely connected to each other, and, this information is not open to the outsiders. So for a long time, Kazakhs were called Kyrgyz, and the Kyrgyz were called Kara Kyrgyz, meaning dark Kyrgyz. So until later it was corrected, right? So, once Soviet Union decided to establish these republics, Kyrgyzstan luckily gets its own republic. And many people like the Tatars, who's a huge population, didn't get its republic because it was stuck in the middle of Russia, right? So it's sort of like hand-picked places. And in fact, they're often given their flag, their official language, their official outfits, costumes for each republic. They're given their the Academy of Science. Everybody had a good Academy of Science. Their theater, their ballet, their opera, and various sort of very Western idea of how to become civilized. So, yet, the policy, what the Russians call Korenizatsiya, Koren means root, going to the roots in the 20s and sort of towards the 30s, is that they started actually reaching out to the indigenous intellectuals in each republic to bring them into the mold. So if you're a Kyrgyz teacher and you believe in Bolshevik ideas, even if you don't, you start thinking, yeah, this is the way to go, the system started incorporating you into the system. So meaning, if you are in a house of culture, you are the chairman of the house of culture, you happen to be Russian because they brought you from Russia to educate Kyrgyz. Well, they slowly tried to replace those Western Soviets with indigenous leaders. So that's what Korenizatsiya, going to the roots, meant. So what are they trying to do with this? They are trying to educate and bring people up to the level they think is civilized. In Russian it's called kulturnost, meaning culturedness. It's awkward in English, right? And they bring you up to that level, but they also wanted you to keep your national culture. So they're trying to play this game where they want you to be Soviet, but they also want you to keep your culture. After all, they created these, republics. They should mean something, right? So people like these people who are post-Soviet people, but they were raised under the Soviet regime, they were allowed to actually, keep their national music and revive their national traditions. But of course the Soviet system is closely controlling it. So the messages had to be along with the ideology, right? So you write a song, it has to be about, equality between, there is no class structure, right? It was about proletariat. It was about, women being equal with men. So I'm going to talk about gender. So this, when I went to visit some of these houses of culture, they're continuing some of this, tradition, in some cases happily, in other cases not so happily. So this is the ultimate house of culture, which is called Palace of Culture, where they actually, you see, again, this is the biggest, in a town called Kochkor, the biggest building in the city, right? And well, in the 70s, many of these houses of culture turned into discos. And after the 70s and the 80s, they became theaters. I mean theaters meaning showing films. And after the Soviet Union fell apart, they became places where American missionaries of all kinds rented these buildings or bought these buildings to actually sponsor missionary activities until Kyrgyz government clamped down on some of those activities. At one point, there were 100 and some different Christian organizations coming only from the US, proselytizing in Kyrgyzstan. My students used to ask, isn't there one Christianity? I don't understand why there are all these, we have Seventh-day Adventists and then the next one is something else, and we don't understand why there are so many, I'll skip these to get us to an earlier period. So I'm going to ask you to sort of travel back in time a little bit. This is how Kyrgyzstan is becoming, in their minds, Sovietized, right? Kyrgyzstan also has, both of our speakers brought up, populations that are non-Kyrgyz, right? So as you see these kids, they're Russian, Ukrainian, Jewish, German, Armenian, and various populations who also needed to be educated, right? So they established like a uniform policy, right? And as you see, they're mixing girls with boys, which wasn't that much of a problem among I would call them European populations, which I mean is Russians, Ukrainians, and others, as opposed to Central Asians. But you also have smaller schools where they're establishing Soviet education system. This is an elementary school, and Uzuk school, I think it was number 5. They always numbered the schools, and I found this in the archives from 1924. And as you see in my second half of the lecture, I'm going to talk about these 4 actresses, and I'm imagining maybe she looks like one of the actresses you can judge when you see her on a picture. But you see the significance of this, right? You have a Russian teacher, a Russian assistant. Actually, I don't know if they are Russian. Nina Andreevna Mikhailova, she could be Ukrainian too. But you see this is sort of the visual image of what that school would have looked like. And I think I presented, in a presentation, I showed this picture in Seattle, an Asian museum lecture, and a teacher said, this reminds me of the Native States. So we could actually elaborate on that if you have any questions. But you see, they also had this policy in the 1920s called Likbez, which means liquidization of illiteracy. So this is a major Soviet policy where they're actually gathering not only kids, but people from the villages to basically educate. So they start from scratch, right? They bring these women and men, and they're focusing on women specifically, and they're bringing them into houses of culture or schools or factories. Each factory has what they call learning corners or reading corners, right? So let's say you're a factory worker, you work all day, and after your work hours, they bring you to teach you how to read and write, right? And it's across the board from all over the place. So you see, these women are all Muslim, yet we are not talking about veils, we are not talking about seclusion, because they have sort of a nomadic approach to Islam. And often women are not even wearing scarves, they are wearing hats and they're exposed their hair. And so they are brought in, and here they're educated by this boy, Shevchenko, who's clearly younger than many of those people there, but he happens to be educated Ukrainian. So they also introduce a new alphabet. You remember we talked about the alphabet? They're really confused. First they introduce Latin alphabet. For a while, everybody's writing Latin alphabet because they're sort of looking at Turkey, where Turkey switched from Persian Arabic alphabet to Latin alphabet. So they copy that. and then they ask a question, well, this is Soviet Union, this is Russia, why use this alphabet? And they switch to Cyrillic alphabet. But you also have really well-functioning propaganda, right? They publish these kind of posters, and they're all over, clubs, factories, schools. In this case, Kalbi Juma Kadirova, she was apparently the best student in school number 4. She's teaching her grandmother how to read, right? So, doesn't get any better than this, right? It's the propaganda measures. But they also have the system called the pioneer system, which is very similar to what in the US. Right. Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, and in fact, they encourage families to have their kids participate, and they specifically pay attention to the girls. They want all the girls to be educated. So, and they continue, and as soon as one person has the alphabet down, they have her teach others. So it's really highly organized, despite the fact that, they might have running water, they might not have paper to write on, yet they make sure that these people are learning to read. And they educate famous teachers like Vaidalevia, and that they are actually, they give them Lenin Awards, they give them medals in terms of, they have all these quotas, how many students they educate and how many kids can read, right? Or grown-ups can read. This goes on and on, all the way into the 40s. And of course, the period I skipped here in these pictures is the 1930s collectivization. As Dr. Loring pointed out, this is an important moment in Soviet history. You pointed out the starvation. So what do? In the 30s, they decide that all of the Soviet Union is supposed to be collectivized. Well, what does collectivization mean for non-agricultural nomadic people? How do you collectivize people who are involved in animal husbandry? What do? They round up people's flocks. They create these collective units. So you have to turn in all your animals to a collective entity. I mean, it's hard to call it a farm because it's not really a farm. And then, you manage your animals through a manager, right? So you no longer have private property, right? So the reaction to that among the Kyrgyz, especially among the Kazakh, less so among the Kyrgyz, they refused to turn in their animals. What did they do? They slaughtered almost all of their flock. And because they'd rather not turn it into the administration or the authorities. And the estimation of starvation, the numbers vary, but we know at least 2 million, up to 4 million Kazakhs perished from hunger, right? So as a punishment, the Soviet system said, well, you slaughtered your animals, find food on your own, right? Of course, these animals, they could only eat so much, no refrigeration, right? So much of that basically disappeared, and people starved. And the same thing happened in Ukraine in a larger context. You probably heard about this, but 7 million Ukrainians perished during collectivization because they refused to collectivize. So the Soviet system actually came in and sealed off whole villages in Ukraine to a point that they would send volunteers in and they would sweep the barns so there's not even one grain of a grain left. And they would seal off the villages so people couldn't leave or come in. And 7 million Ukrainians perished. They consider this a genocide, and they want the world to acknowledge it, and it's not still officially acknowledged. So, yet, in the 40s, they are moving into this huge infrastructural, reform. So they are building reservoirs. Kyrgyzstan is a mountainous place, so it's the best place to take advantage of hydroelectric stations, reservoirs, and they are actually, having individual farmers no longer, animal husbandry, so they give them jobs to build them. And they have these wonderful propaganda posters, right? So they might make sure you have several ethnicities represented, that they are actually participating in this process. All the way into 40s, you see under Stalin statue, these women are proud to be educated and proud to pose for these pictures. Another project is actually to teach women how to run machinery. So it was important that they pointed out, unlike elsewhere in the world, women needed to be able to operate machinery just as men. So they make sure that women are posing with tractors and other machinery as models for younger girls, right? I mean, they carried it so far. I mean, there were kids named Traktor, televisor, meaning television, right? Later, and they took it seriously, right? I mean, I had in my class when I taught two twin girls. One was named Reva, the other was Lucia, which means revolution, right? So it's so important to them to participate in this process. So this brings me, what time do we have?
We're up till 2:30.
Okay, right. So let's talk a little more about impact of these policies on actual individuals. I'm writing a book on 4 actors, 4 female actors, I guess actresses, no politically correct now to say actress, but female actors who came out of the same town. Remember that picture I showed you with little girls? That's the town. And the reason I came into this project is while I was working there, I met Sabira Kemshalieva, who, since then she died, that she was sort of a living legend. Born in 1917 during the Bolshevik Revolution, who actually worked as a well-known later in her life, theater actress, and then became a film actress and won the biggest, Soviet Union's version of the Oscars, Lenin medals and things like that. So this is from our interview. She came, this was a summer, I think it was 2005, and she came wearing her, what they call elechek, or elderly women will wear that hat, and her chapan, which is her embroidered coat. This is a closer picture. As you see, this is in her studio or her dressing room. Her walls are full of, and she talked about 2.5 hours nonstop. I was exhausted and she wanted to continue, but I could not absorb it and my recorder ran out of image. So she was in that year, she was in 3 plays. 2005, how old was she, right? So these are some of her photos from various films. And I'm going to talk about what these films and plays are about. And this is when she's playing Madame Butterfly on stage. So what the Soviet Union did, it took this cultural development, as they call, bringing up, they keep using this term, bringing people up to a certain level, very seriously. So they established theaters, and they were very careful to establish 2 types of theaters. One Western theater, one indigenous national theater, right? So the national theaters put on plays representing the indigenous, what they call tradition and culture, right? So if I go back, here she is playing a Kyrgyz grandmother in a play, that which became a film. And these are Chingiz Aytmatov stories that turned into plays. I'll show you about Chingiz Aytmatov in a minute. Yet, they also asked these actresses, often they didn't have enough actors and actresses to act in the Western theater, which was geared towards entertaining and educating Russians and other populations, right? So they usually had Russian, Ukrainian, Jewish, and other actors, Armenian actors in these plays, yet often Kyrgyz people participated in it. So that's, hence she's playing Madame Butterfly, and she talked about how they loved it because she looked Japanese, as opposed to some of the Russian actors. And later in her life, actually, you know, just like in the US, they had some publicity photos, you know, hired photographers to talk about them. She's a tough and a wonderful person here. And in fact, towards the end of her life, she received the biggest award. This is Chingiz Aytmatov that Ben talked about, one of the most valued novelists in the Soviet Union. In fact, Gorbachev said Aytmatov was his favorite writer over any Russian writers or others. So she's receiving an award there for a film. And they, of course, had many jubilees, they called them, you know, honoring these actors and actresses. Then there are three other people who took a similar path. You see Baken Kekova here, and a younger actress who is in a play. She died much younger, and she was born later, died younger, but she became sort of the, you know, sweetheart of Kyrgyzstan. Sort of, they compare her to Eva Gardner and, you know, that sort of period. And here she's older and she's playing in a play called Mother Earth. And here, this is why they compare her to Eva Gardner, I guess, that they kind of resembled some of the Western actresses. And in fact, biographies talk about her being sort of the most suitable actress to play Western parts, right? Another actress, she's playing a man here. She's playing a shaman, Dartel Kekova. She was born 2 years after Gümüşhalieva and died much younger, unfortunately. But highly valued actress. This is from a film, another film, and this is her actual sort of publicity photo in her house. And you see how powerful these women became. They're winning many medals. Here's Gümüşhalieva, and often they became the party leaders, party members. So they are playing several roles, which I'm trying to sort of convey, is that they're not only playing what their ethnicity and nationality on stage, but they're supposed to uphold the traditions, because women are often burdened by that, but also they're supposed to be good Soviet citizens. So you see how this is happening, right? Many of these women went against their families' desires to become actors. Even though they're not strict Muslims like Uzbeks and Tajiks, yet for a woman to be on stage is unheard of before their generation. And often these women actually would, if you read them, and I interviewed many of their grandchildren, children, they would escape to go get acting lessons. They would hide, they'd be beaten up by their fathers, they'd go back the next day. In some cases, the fathers encouraged them, right? In one case, the father would dress his daughter in boys' clothes so she could actually go out and do whatever she wanted to do, sing or act. So there's a complex picture there. Here is the former president of Kyrgyzstan, Askar Akayev. Again, Kimishelieva is highly valued. You see, this is also part of that propaganda and process that these women represent the nation, we need to value them. Sadly, she died in poverty. You know, they receive very little pension because this is a system where they live on pension. So, Cengiz Aytmatov is really, sorry I didn't update the date here, he passed away in 2008, I think, right? Right, and he is the one who is considered basically one of the most important writers of the Soviet Union. And what is interesting about him is that he survived the purges. People always ask, how was it possible that he did? Because he is writing about what Soviets might consider bourgeois nationalism. Any guess what bourgeois nationalism would mean for the Soviets? Basically, if you talk about your ethnicity and nationality over the Soviet identity, then you are considered bourgeois nationalist. And many people who perished in the 30s were those people. He survived it. One of the reasons people claim that he wrote about, not just about Kyrgyzstan, but Kazakhstan and others. So he's playing this very carefully in incorporating other ethnicities into his stories. As a result, he's a good Soviet writer. That's one of the ways in which he survived. In other ways, he actually wrote in between the lines, and often the critics wouldn't really, he's such a skillful writer that critics wouldn't understand his criticism of the system. So, one of his most important books is called First Teacher, and you can actually I found the film in the US, believe it or not, so it's a short film, black and white film I show in my classes. And his most famous story is Jamila. It's Susan is writing and yes, and Jamila is available in English. You may be able to find that. And several other stories became plays and films later on. So, in addition to these actors, what about ordinary women? You know, there's this idea called Stanahovite. It's after a young man who was named Stanahov. And he basically, Soviet Union had these quotas for everything, right? So if you're a cotton farmer, if you collected a certain bales of cotton, you were a Soviet hero. You've given medals, you've given maybe, if you are so good, you're given an apartment. You can shop in the elite stores. So this is how they rewarded those people who proved that they were the best in their system. In this case, this milkmaid milked more cows than anybody else, and she gets a big medal, and her photograph is all over the newspapers. But of all these people, the most important person was in Kyrgyzstan, Zurakan Kaynazarova. You see her when she was a young beet farmer, and she's collecting beets, and later in her life, you see the medals she got. So she represented, she surpassed the quota of collecting beets and became the head of her kolkhoz, meaning collective farm. And to follow through, she adopted 3 girls to raise them. And the 3 girls, as you see, are not Kyrgyz, right? So she's actually following the formula so well that she's a mother to these 3 infant Ukrainian girls, or whatever they are. I don't have the record of it, whoever they are. But she's also being a good Kyrgyz woman by, being able to do handicrafts, right? She's a superwoman, right? So as a result, these people are elevated to positions of being heroes of the system. And she became a Soviet Supreme, member of the Soviet Supreme Supreme Soviet, and received many medals for that. And as a result, you see her busts and her, statues all over the country. With this, they made sure that because they see Muslim populations, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Turkmens, Kazakhs, and Kyrgyz, as, keeping the women backwards because they're Muslim. Well, they knew very little about nomadic population like Kazakhs and Kyrgyz, where they raised their daughters and sons the same way for practical reasons. Girls need to get on the horse and, they have to do everything that boys do, right? So Islam did not sort of penetrate the same way, but they, in this wonderful Soviet style, they would actually have their artists depict what they saw as necessary, right? In this one, by Koichiev, it's Pervia Bukli, first letters. So you see how this young girl is teaching or learning how to write. This is a triptych, three pieces together. This is at the meeting. You see here, you have a Kyrgyz woman in its so-called traditional outfit, a Kyrgyz man who is part of the Red Army, and a Kyrgyz woman who is in sort of modern outfit, right? So they are juxtaposing all that, saying, we are going to allow your culture as long as you actually learn to be a good Soviet citizen. And finally, bride, you see her husband is probably going to war, and yet she is dressed in a, what you may call, traditional outfit, right? So that's what I will end with, and take questions. Yes?
Can you go back to that last couple of slides? I'm just curious about the depiction of skin color on this.
Yeah, you see.
Is this like the Kara Kyrgyz or
Kara Kyrgyz idea, right? I mean, because they lived in the mountains, people are always exposed to the elements, as opposed to Kazakhs.
We had in the U.S. in the 1920s and 30s, right. Just lack of rain, dust storms, strange weather patterns that people hadn't seen before. And so there are a lot of changes going on right now, and on top of the sort of toxicity. But one other thing I would mention is that Kazakhstan is where the Russians launch all of the missions to the space station now.
Right.
And there's a lot of fallout from that. Basically, all of the fuel, all the things that come off of a rocket. We kind of do it over the ocean.
Baikonur, right?
In Baikonur, it falls on the people there.
Right.
So it's probably one of the most polluted areas of the world. And it's only going to be more challenging as we go forward as things heat up.
Right. I mean, you can also look up Kate Brown's work called Plutopia, and she wrote several articles on Kazakhstan, comparing Kazakhstan with the U.S. But her new book is about Kate Brown. She's at
Plutopia?
Plutopia.
PLU?
Yeah, PLU, like plutonium.
Oh.
She's actually right here. She's at UMBC. She's a professor, and this book won every award that exists. And so it's outside of Kazakhstan, yet it's connected to what we are talking about. She compares an American plutonium industry with the Soviet plutonium industry, and these towns that were created just to support this uranium and plutonium, and wasting of lying to people that this was the future, and many people dying of these side effects working in these towns. I think one is Richland, Washington, and the other is Mayak, Russia. So those kind of things. But also, finally, there is a social aspect of all this. For example, in Kyrgyzstan, I think the gender ratio is 1 man to every 3 women.
Yeah, probably.
Several reasons. Men are consuming great deals of alcohol, great deal of unemployment, and they are migrant workers in Russia and various parts of the world. So you go into households in Kyrgyzstan of women, grandmothers, aunts, you know, wives whose husbands are not around. They go to send money back. The remittances are supposed to support the family. Well, they send some money for a while, then they marry a Russian girl and never come back. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little, but this is some of that pattern. So it's a pretty rough situation. Despite the fact Kyrgyzstan is full of really strong women like these, there's a legacy that are establishing NGOs, they are establishing support groups for women and children and widows and other, you know, orphans and things like that. So there's a positive aspect of sort of women taking the helm. And in fact, for a long time, the president of Kyrgyzstan was Rosa Otunbayeva, who was a woman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just throw in, the State Department still does bring through the flex programs students from Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. You can host any of these students.
Yes.
Yes.
It's a fabulous program. Looks like IRX is still sending some undergraduates and graduates according to their website.
They are?
That's what it said.
They are, but the offices in those countries were
Yeah.
closed.
So you have to apply in
You
that
can
country
you
to
can
be brought
you can
over.
get the money and you can go, but
Got it.
the support that an IROC's office gave was it introduced you to scholars, it introduced you to all of these wonderful resources. I had an IROC's grant from Kyrgyzstan, it was great, but I was there when they closed the office in Uzbekistan,
Yeah, was the
and I couldn't get
Kyrgyz.
into the country. I mean, it was just like,
I mean, that's how we got our degrees,
Yeah.
with this kind of funding. How else can you go to Kyrgyzstan, spend a year? You need some kind of funding to be able to do that. So it's all dried up.
We could go as teachers too.
Yes,
oh yes,
right.
absolutely.
The most recent article, the most recent issue of Aramco World Magazine has an article on the partnership between the sister cities in Seattle, or no, it's another town like that, but anyway, with Uzbekistan.
Right.
It's time to fill out your evaluation forms, please.